Pablo and Tiffany have decided to give their only son Diego a lot of independence while growing up. This came with a lot of advantages, but they soon realized it also brought some challenges. They started noticing that Diego was staying out about an hour longer every day after school, and when he didn't want to tell them the reason, they got very worried. But why did Diego started coming home late every day? Why did he keep his reasons a secret? What was Diego hiding from them, and could Pablo and Tiffany ever look at their son the same way after this? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. When Pablo heard his son Diego fearfully shout, "Who's there?" he knew there was no other choice but to reveal himself. He had been caught in the act. He stood up and walked out of the dense vegetation where a scared Diego was waiting. He seemed almost relieved to see him. While Pablo was trying to explain why he was following his own son, he noticed that Diego was trying to shield something behind his back, doing his very best not to let Pablo see what it was. Diego had been acting really suspicious lately. Could this be the explanation Pablo had been looking for? Pablo took a few steps closer and was finally able to see what his son was hiding. He couldn't believe it. Was this the reason that Diego was disappearing every day? Suddenly, everything made sense to Pablo. Pablo and Tiffany had been together for going on 12 years now, and they were very happy together. They also had an 8-year-old son named Diego. The couple has really been enjoying the process of raising a child. They tried to embrace all of the challenges of child rearing, of which there were a lot. From the moment Pablo and Tiffany started discussing the possibility of having children, they agreed on one important thing, that they didn't want to raise their children the way their parents had raised them. Both of them had some very bad childhood memories, and their parents were to blame for them. Both sets of parents were very strict with their children. To both Pablo and Tiffany, it felt like everything had to be controlled at all times. Each of them often felt like they were living in a prison. This had left a lot of mental scars, but also a firm belief that a different parenting approach would work much better. So as Diego grew older, his parents left him with very few restrictions. They wanted him to have independence from a young age. Of course, if he needed help, they were there for him. But they weren't going to micromanage his life. This was Pablo and Tiffany's way of doing their parenting duties, completely different from their own parents' ways, and it seemed that they were kind of right with going for this approach. Diego seemed to thrive with all the freedom he was getting. He was doing well in school and had a lot of friends. And on top of that, people were always praising what a nice and polite kid he was becoming. This, of course, made the couple very happy. They had received a lot of criticism from friends and family when announcing that this is the route they wanted to take with their son, and his success felt almost like some sort of vindication in light of all of that, especially against their parents. Their parents were anything but happy with how Pablo and Tiffany were raising their son. Therefore, it annoyed them even more that Pablo and Tiffany's parenting style seemed to be successful. It was proven that they had been wrong in their approach and they were not ready to accept their mistakes. Tiffany's parents eventually came around to the approach and apologized for their own shortcomings. She was very open to accepting the apology and worked to make amends with that side of the family. Pablo's parents, however, were a lot less open to the success of different parenting styles and made a very rash decision. They decided to cut ties with the family altogether. This saddened Pablo very much, but he realized that this was probably for the better. He knew his parents were a bad influence on Diego, and it would probably be better to not have them in his life anymore. But Pablo didn't consider some of the deeper effects for Diego. With Pablo's parents out of the picture and Tiffany's parents on board with their process of raising Diego as free as possible, Pablo and Tiffany received much less pushback. But even the most free-thinking, carefree new parents have to have some rules in place. For Pablo and Tiffany, this was no different, and they had one particularly important rule for Diego. Even though Diego was allowed to do almost anything he deemed right, Pablo and Tiffany did want to be kept in the know about everything. They did not want Diego doing things behind their back. They were afraid that if this started happening, it could maybe sour the good bond they now seem to have together. This all was no problem for Diego. He knew that, barring a few obvious things, his parents would not make a big deal out of anything he was doing. He would be remiss to ruin their good graces. But as kids grow older, they often become less inclined to tell their parents everything, especially about certain topics. It was a few days after Diego turned 8 that Pablo started noticing a strange pattern in the daily routine of his son. He knew when Diego would get out of school, and though it wasn't uncommon for him to hang around a little while after, he now started coming home an hour later than expected every day. Pablo held off the urge to ask Diego why he was late every day, in the hope that his son would maybe address it without being explicitly asked. But this didn't seem to be happening, and the longer all this went on, the more Pablo started to doubt himself and his son. Almost 3 weeks had passed. Pablo had talked about it extensively with Tiffany. They wanted to know what was going on and what he was doing, but this would go against their ideology of giving Diego his freedom and trusting him that he would be open and honest about everything with them. After a lot of deliberation, they decided that Pablo was going to ask about it. That same day, after Diego came home from school again about an hour late, Pablo asked him why this was happening so consistently and what he was doing after school. He was surprised by the answer he got. Diego told him that he had an extra class that he was taking. It took place after school. It apparently was not on a particular subject, more like an extracurricular for every subject. When Pablo told this to Tiffany, she was very surprised as well, and she had a good reason for this. Tiffany knew the school that Diego went to very well. Though Diego was unaware, Tiffany was actually on a consultancy board for the school and helped them make decisions about the policies. She was sure that if classes like what Diego described were being given, she would have known about it. But she didn't. To double-check, Tiffany even brought it up at the next meeting she had a few days later, and her suspicions were confirmed. There were no classes like that being taught at school, nor have they ever been. But the principal of the school had even more worrying news for her. He had noticed that Diego had almost always left school immediately after the lessons were done. He assumed, of course, that Diego was just going home, as the principal had no reason to believe otherwise. But once he was talking about it with Tiffany, the principal suddenly realized something else. The reason it had stood out to him that Diego had always left directly after class was because he was one of the first out the door every day, but also that he was always alone. While previously he would always wait for at least a couple of his friends to walk together for as long as possible. This set off a lot of alarm bells in Tiffany's head. Diego was, to her knowledge, a very popular kid and always seemed to have friends around him. It was one of the reasons she had always been confident in letting him walk home after school. She started having major second thoughts about this. Now Tiffany was worried sick. Not only did the principal confirm that her son had been lying to them and keeping secrets, but he also appeared to be engaging in unknown activities on his own. On the way home, all she could think about was whether she had made the right parenting decisions. She wanted to confront her son immediately, but he was at a friend's house. At home, she told Pablo everything. Unlike her, he believed their son wouldn't do anything reckless or dangerous. Pablo worried that confronting Diego might damage the trust they had built with him, but Tiffany was determined to uncover the truth. After much debate, Pablo devised a plan. He would secretly follow Diego the next day to find out what he was up to. The couple worked on the details carefully. Pablo decided to wear old clothes Diego wouldn't recognize and bought a new cap to blend in. However, the challenge of following a child unnoticed lingered until their neighbor inadvertently offered a solution. He needed someone to walk his dog the following afternoon, and Pablo agreed, realizing it was the perfect cover. The next day, Pablo waited near the school with the dog, keeping a safe distance. As the bell rang, Diego hurried out, oblivious to being followed. Pablo, walking at a casual pace with the dog, trailed him discreetly. After a while, he noticed Diego heading toward the forest, which puzzled him. While Diego occasionally played there with friends, he seemed to be going alone this time. Diego hadn't looked back even once, which worked in Pablo's favor. As they moved further away from the city center, the area grew quieter, leaving Pablo more exposed. Still, he maintained his distance, determined to find out what his son was doing. Diego suddenly turned purposefully into the denser part of the forest. Pablo noticed a tree marked with red, likely Diego's way of remembering the path. As Pablo followed, the dense vegetation slowed him down, while Diego's smaller frame allowed him to move swiftly. Pablo struggled to keep up while managing the neighbor's chihuahua. Through glimpses of Diego's red coat, Pablo kept his distance. After a while, Diego stopped. Pablo moved closer quietly, trying to observe without being seen. Just as he found a vantage point, the dog barked loudly, breaking the silence. Startled, Diego called out, "Who's there?" Pablo, knowing he'd been discovered, stepped out and revealed himself. Diego's initial relief turned into confusion as he demanded to know why his father was there with the neighbor's dog. Pablo, deciding honesty was the best course, explained everything. As he spoke, it became clear Diego was shielding something on the ground behind him. The dog growled, adding to the tension. Diego hesitated, trying to deflect, but Pablo moved closer, determined to uncover the secret. Finally, he saw what Diego was hiding: a blanket covering a group of young foxes. Pablo, stunned, asked Diego to explain. Diego recounted how weeks ago he and his friends accidentally killed a mother fox while playing in the forest. Overwhelmed with guilt, Diego decided to secretly care for the orphaned foxes, feeding them daily. He hadn't told his parents out of fear and shame. Pablo, moved by the story, felt a mix of pride in Diego's compassion and disappointment in his secrecy. Embracing his son, Pablo promised to help. Together, they decided to take the foxes home to care for them properly before releasing them back into the wild. Pablo was certain Tiffany would come around once she understood. Over the next few months, the family nurtured the foxes until they were ready to return to their natural habitat. The ordeal strengthened the trust between Diego and his parents, leaving their family bond as strong as ever. In the end, Diego and his parents not only saved the young foxes but also deepened their bond as a family. Through love, trust, and understanding, they turned a challenging situation into a story of growth and compassion. As they watched the foxes return to the wild, they knew their efforts had made a lasting difference. What do you think about this heartfelt story? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your own experiences or opinions. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible stories.